And let me say happy National Nutrition Month. Canada's theme for the month is to unlock the potential of food. So I think this is very apt for us to be meeting tonight. So let's see if we can unlock the potential of food for migraine. I like to start by talking a little bit about me, partly because there is no shortage of opinions on food and migraine. And I like to start by explaining who I am, so you know where I'm coming from, you know what my credentials are, my training, and what are my biases, because we all have them, so we might as well get them out there. So I am a registered dietitian nutritionist. I'm credentialed in the United States. RDNs are the credentialed nutrition professionals working in clinical nutrition, so hospitals, long-term care facilities, and so forth. So I have that clinical nutrition training. I have a PhD in food science, which may be a little bit of a unique combination for some. My specialization was in food composition analysis. And so I know food down to a molecular level, how to analyze what's in it, how the molecules interact with each other. So add that to the fact that I have migraine, and I have for a number of years now. And not that that's necessary to be here talking, but I do think it gives me a different perspective and certainly empathy for anyone living with this condition. And roll all of that together, and that's how I became and was motivated to become a migraine researcher in this specific area. So I have published peer-reviewed articles on this topic in journals like Headache and Nutritional Neuroscience. I presented at various scientific conferences. So I really come at this from an evidence-based approach, and you'll hear that woven throughout. So that's me. In order to do research, we need to get funding. So I have some disclosures about my various funding sources of the research I do in migraine and other places, other topics, and those are listed here. So today's questions, these are some of the questions that were posed to me that I could talk about tonight, and there are way too many questions that we could possibly get to tonight, but this is the plan. So we'll talk about recent research about overall eating patterns and how they might influence migraine outcomes over time. We'll talk about what you should know about skipping meals and fasting and what that means for migraine. A little bit about food triggers for migraine, what we know, what we don't. Should we take supplements? And then last but not least, how long do we need to follow a diet to see if it helps with migraine? I will weave that throughout as well. And in addition to the other disclosures already stated, of course, consult with your healthcare professional for anything specific to you. I'm really presenting evidence as it relates to adults. It's already tight to fit all this in for adults. I won't be talking about pediatrics or kids today. So first, I want to keep things in perspective and talk about how, and just maybe acknowledge that the landscape of nutritional evidence for migraine is changing in a good way. There's more evidence coming in. Frankly, it's getting difficult to keep up with all the papers coming in around the world, so that's great. But I do want to caution also, there's still so much we don't know. So I need to beg for your patience. We still need patience in interpreting this. And especially when we get to the Q&A at the end, you will all have amazing questions that would make amazing research studies that I won't have answers for. So bear with me. But the landscape is changing. We're making progress here. The other thing that I want to say about evidence is this, and this is this balance between the burden of doing a dietary intervention, making a change to your own diet, and the strength of the evidence that says it will help migraine, and the research evidence that we have to there. And so we're sort of in this balancing act, balancing the burden versus evidence in making dietary recommendations for migraine. And I don't know that we've always got this balance correct in the past. At times, I think we've sort of thrown dietary recommendations around for migraine, saying things like, oh, just, eliminate these many foods from your diet and see what happens, just give it a try, when in fact that might be changing everything about your eating pattern and not fully recognizing that. So I want to mention that this is something that I see and that I weigh heavily as I think about what to recommend for diet and migraine. And here's the last thing I want to put in context before we really start to jump in. I want to recognize that dietary migraine research is advancing at the same time as our general nutrition guidelines are advancing. And what we're seeing in the nutrition community is this evolution of guidelines away from the specific nutrients, focusing on, get enough nutrient X, don't, avoid nutrient Y. And we're seeing this shift to kind of what you see on the screen, which is overall eating patterns and recommending overall eating patterns like we see here. So for example, this is from Health Canada. This is something I use actually in a lot of presentations, not just for you guys. I love this image, and this aligns with some common recommendations to try to fill your plate every meal, half with fruits and vegetables, a variety of fruits and vegetables, a quarter with whole grains, and a quarter with lean proteins, and then unsweetened beverages, water, when you can. And so this is what I'm trying to emphasize when I talk about what food patterns, eating patterns. It's this idea that we don't eat nutrients, we eat foods, and we eat foods in combination in meals, and recognize that we eat foods together with our friends, with our family, to celebrate, to mourn, to just get together and socialize. And so food is a sort of better way for us to be talking about nutrition recommendations. And so you'll see that in how I talk about some of the evidence for migraine as well, I think. So then let's take this opportunity and jump into talking about eating patterns that have been studied for migraine. So if we look in and dive into the literature and really look at all the things, the eating patterns that have been studied for migraine, there are quite a few. Many different diets have been tested in relation to migraine in one way or another, and some of them are listed here. I'm sure I missed some. So a low glycemic diet, low lipid, low fat vegan, various ways of attempting to remove triggers from the diet, various ways of controlling fat like omega-3 and omega-6 ratio or ketogenic. And if we look at all of these studies individually, the interesting thing is that many of them, if not actually most of them, see some benefit from modifying the diet. If you measure how many migraines frequency someone has before they start a diet, put them on this dietary intervention, one of the ones you see here, and then measure how many migraines they're having, how frequently after they've been on the diet for a while. Most of these diets show some sort of benefit, usually a couple days per month decrease in migraine days. And so that's great on one hand, but on the other hand, it can't all be true. And so this is a potential problem for us. And so you might be asking, well, if all of this evidence shows, all these scientific studies, why aren't we seeing strong recommendations for nutrition and migraine? And the big reason is that most of these studies, if we evaluate them based on the quality of the scientific design, most of them are considered low quality evidence for dietary interventions for migraine. And what this means is mostly that we can't isolate the dietary intervention as the thing that caused the change that we saw, that there's a lot of potential for other things to be happening in the background that maybe weren't controlled properly in the study design, that may be influencing the migraine outcome as well. And we don't know if it's the diet causing the change or the stress causing the change, or even the fact that they knew they were eating and changing their diet, maybe that gave a placebo effect. So that's why we're not seeing these huge sweeping recommendations, but there are a lot of studies out there at this point that have attempted to answer this question. So take heart from that. But what we are doing is we're learning from these studies, skeptical of some of the results, but we're learning from these studies and learning to design better ones. So we're getting there. So then let's talk about the studies that I think have the best evidence that's out there for overall eating patterns that help to reduce migraine. So specifically, this is someone who has migraine and is looking to modify your diet to hopefully see reductions in migraine frequency or severity or some sort of outcome. And so I have I have 3 separate diets to talk about kind of in this level of detail. And each of them will follow the same pattern that we'll talk about what is the diet, briefly, what's the evidence, who might benefit from this specific diet. So if you're trying to find one, which would you consider? How long do we need to follow a diet to see the results? And what does this diet look like in real life if I actually want to try it? So here we go. So I've heard there may be questions already about the ketogenic diet, so we're jumping in. Let's talk about the ketogenic diet. This, as many of you probably already know, is a diet that restricts carbohydrates to very low levels. It also restricts protein to generally moderate levels. And in order to make up for the reduction in energy from carbs and proteins, it increases fat intake to pretty high levels as a result. And the diet was originally designed for epilepsy, as a treatment for epilepsy. And it was shown in the early 1900s to have a benefit at reducing epileptic seizures. And so it was studied as early as I found the 1920s, late 1920s, looking at the relationship between the ketogenic diet and migraine, partly because of the similarities of these diseases. And originally it was observed that when people with epilepsy were in a fasting state, so they hadn't eaten for a while, they had less seizures. And so what the ketogenic diet does is sort of fools your body's metabolism to act as though you're in a fasting state, to metabolize fats as though you haven't eaten in a long time, even though you're continually eating fat, but you're keeping the carbohydrates so low that you're tricking the body into thinking you're not eating as much. Anyway, so that's where it came from. So the evidence for the ketogenic diet for migraine, so there was that splurge of research in the 30s, and then not so much for a number of decades. And then in the past decade or so, we've seen a couple clinical randomized controlled trials, our highest level of evidence, come out for the ketogenic diet in migraine. They are small, they are varied, they're not perfect. And so this is why we don't see, people singing from the rooftops about this. But they do show fairly consistent decreases in headache days per month for the people who finish the study. It is a difficult diet, so you do get people who don't finish. And generally, for most studies, we're talking, again, a few headache days per month for people. For who might the ketogenic diet benefit the most, who might be most interested, because it's a difficult diet, and it's not something that if you just have a few migraines once in a while, very episodic, it's probably not worth it for you. But for someone with 4 or more migraine days per month, it's been recommended that you might consider it. For someone who's overweight or someone with metabolic syndrome, so metabolic syndrome could involve impaired fasting glucose levels, abdominal obesity, so carrying extra fat around the waistline, high triglycerides, and overweight as well. So that may be someone who could look into it. And this is, again, because of it's shifting the metabolism. It has benefits for insulin sensitivity and blood glucose control. And then the other person who might benefit from the ketogenic diet is someone who genuinely wants to try it, wants to do it. It's not the type of diet that you can go into lightly. So you'd really have to be motivated to make all these changes. For how long to follow the diet, again, I'm really going by the evidence here. The studies, the interventions that have tested it have lasted generally from 1 to 3 months. And so some studies have seen a benefit at the end of about a month. Others have looked out to about 3 months and seen a reduction in headache frequency. For those that have observed longer, even out to something like 6 months, the person might not be on the diet the whole time. They return to their diet. And for some people, it seems like there could be lasting effects, that the benefits gained from doing the ketogenic diet might linger a little longer, at least a few months than the time you're actually on the diet. So something interesting to consider. So again, what does it actually look like? So high fat, low carbs, moderate protein. And because of the way it works with your metabolism, it's not the type of diet that you can cheat. There are no cheat days when you're in the throes of the ketogenic diet. So if the typical diet is here, typical Western diet, the way we eat in the US and Canada, typical diet would be about half of your calories coming from carbohydrates, about a third coming from fat, and the rest coming from protein. And so again, majority of calories, energy coming from carbohydrates. The classic ketogenic diet, the one originally tested and demonstrated in epilepsy, is on the far left, where you see the vast majority of calories are coming from fat, a very minimal amount from carbs, and a smidge from protein as well. And this is because protein in the metabolism some types of amino acids can be converted to glucose in the body. And so what we're really looking at is the ratio of carbs plus protein versus fat. And so that's why we do also have to restrict protein on the ketogenic diet. And so this, again, the classic ketogenic diet, we found ways to work with metabolism to maintain a state of ketosis where your body is still metabolizing fats in this altered pathway producing ketones. And the modified Atkins and the medium chain triglyceride diet are two different ways that we can do that. And we can liberalize the amount of carbohydrates that you can eat while still maintaining a state of ketosis. And this is part of what complicates the evidence for the ketogenic diet as well, because we actually see different versions of the ketogenic diet, and not all of them are even represented here, but we see different versions studied in the research. And so even when looking at two studies of ketogenic diet and migraine, we're not necessarily even looking at the same thing. But just to get a sense of what this might look like, this is the classic ketogenic diet. So this is the most strict of the three. But here, this is a menu put out in some guidelines by the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics a couple of years ago. And this is what a diet might look like. So for breakfast, you might have an egg scramble, but you wouldn't have a side of toast. Your egg scramble would be made with lots of fat. So butter, cream, feta cheese, olive oil, spinach, mushrooms for breakfast. For your lunch could be a Cobb salad, so mixed greens, avocado, hard-boiled egg, bacon, hard cheese, olive oil, and a controlled amount of vinegar, because vinegar does have some carbs in it. And then for dinner, chicken with zucchini noodles or zoodles, spiraled zucchini, baked chicken breast, olive oil, and basil pesto. And then a snack could be stalk of celery with full-fat cream cheese. And again, this is the strictest of the diets. This, I believe, was about 1,700 calories per day. And in general, the other benefit that we haven't talked about, in addition to weight loss, common on the ketogenic diet, is it really suppresses appetite. It works with the hormones in such a way that you don't feel hungry nearly the same way. So I understand, I see in the comments, wouldn't be able to do it. I get it. But even once you get into it, there is some help there from your metabolism, believe it or not, that you don't necessarily crave foods in the same way. So that's the ketogenic diet. So let's move on to the next pattern. I think that has pretty good evidence. And this is a diet that is high in omega-3 fatty acids and low in omega-6 fatty acids. And this is an overall eating pattern. So what is it? So it's an eating pattern really designed to control intake of these. They're both essential fatty acids. So omega-3 is one type of essential fatty acid. Omega-6 is another type of essential fatty acids. They are both polyunsaturated, and they differ in the arrangement of the chemical bonds in the structure. We've seen over time in different research studies benefits to health when intake of omega-3 is high and intake of omega-6 is lower. And we've seen benefits in I'm trying to think, inflammation generally, but also some autoimmune diseases as well. And so people have been looking at this in migraine. And there are two very well-designed randomized controlled trials, again, that highest level of evidence. One was looking at chronic daily headache, but mostly people with migraine, and the other was looking at specifically people with migraine. And both of these studies, very well-controlled controlled diet versus high omega-3, low omega-6. They saw improvements in migraine days, and it was about a reduction in people who started with 16 headache days per month. They saw a reduction by about 4 headache days So a reduction of from 16 to 12, if you will. The other thing I really like about this research is they didn't just walk into it and say, let's study this eating pattern. They really spent years, a decade at least, looking at biomarkers for pain. And they, in the second study, the second RCT, they also demonstrated not only did they see a reduction in migraine days, but they also saw a reduction in the biomarker that they expected would be associated with pain, the type of oxylipin. And so this has this kind of validation of, yes, the clinical outcome, what you see in the, what I can tell you, yes, my headache days have decreased by filling out my diary, but also some blood markers to validate that. So good evidence there. Strictly, the studies looked at people 5 to 20 migraine days per month, the second study at least. And so that's what I've listed as who might it benefit. But generally, again, I mentioned it's this eating style, increasing omega-3s, lowering omega-6s has been shown to be good for inflammation generally. So I don't know that I would limit this recommendation to people with more migraine days. I think it could potentially be helpful for others. The study itself lasted 16 weeks. And so that's what I've listed here. Generally speaking, this would, my intuition, hasn't been tested, but my intuition is that this would take longer to show up at your level, something you would notice than the ketogenic diet. And so the study lasted 16 weeks. I would give it, at least 3 months before making a verdict on this one. And what does it look like? So high omega-3, high fish intake, and then low omega-6 would be foods that are low in vegetable oil. So what do I mean by that? So vegetable oil, as at least here in the States, is listed on food labels, and it could mean a number of different oils. The one that's not in my picture here is soybean oil, is actually the most common in our food supply. But soybean oil, sunflower, canola, safflower, all have pretty high amounts of omega-6 fatty acid in them. And so those are ones that you want to potentially, if you're considering this, pull out of your cabinet and start cooking with olive oil if you could. That's sort of an easy swap. I know olive oil doesn't fit in every recipe. It gets smoky. It probably isn't the best in a lot of baked goods, but where you can, that's an easy substitution to get rid of some omega-6s and replace it with some monounsaturated fats like from olive oil. The other thing to know about omega-6s and vegetable oils is that really they are the predominant oils in processed foods in our food supply. So chips and frozen dinners and pasta sauces and even peanut butter and so forth. A lot of these fats just, in processed foods, used to cook foods, contain high levels of omega-6. So that is probably the hardest part about doing this eating pattern, following this eating pattern, is that it really goes kind of against what we commonly eat in our regular day-to-day. And so it would take some really careful label reading to try to choose foods without vegetable oils. And then omega-3, really what I'm talking about is what we call the long chain omega-3s. These are the ones found in fish, especially fatty fish, salmon, mackerel, herring. Omega-3s are also found in some plant-based foods like flax seeds, and chia seeds have a pretty good amount. Those are not long chain, they're a shorter chain of fatty acid, again, referring to the chemical structure. They're still good, they're still beneficial. And so I would still recommend getting them, but they're sort of not as good as the long chain that we get from fish, the EPA and DHA versions. And so that's what you're looking for with those two diets. The challenges, they're both difficult to follow, as we've alluded to, but I want to say don't be discouraged. We have evidence for these diets, partly because they're so different from our typical eating patterns. And it's easier, I think, from a research perspective to demonstrate when you make such a big change from a typical diet, we can see changes in migraine patterns more easily, right? So I think the reason we have evidence for these diets first and not kind of the easier diets is because they're so different. But I do recommend seeking nutrition counseling from a dietitian to implement them correctly if you're endeavoring in them, especially the ketogenic diet. And a dietitian could definitely help make the omega-3, omega-6 eating pattern easier. So the last pattern I'll talk about is increasing evidence for a low glycemic diet. I think we're starting to see more evidence here. And this is an eating pattern that prioritizes foods that have a lesser impact on blood glucose. What do I mean by that? So let's talk. So if you eat a food, let's say over here at time 0, and we measure your blood glucose levels every couple minutes for up to 2 hours, some foods will digest and get absorbed as glucose into your bloodstream very quickly. And that's what we see here in the red. So this is like a soda pop, soft drink, cola, sugar sweetened, that if you eat it or drink it, I should say, passes through your stomach, hits your small intestine very quickly, doesn't need any digestion, and your blood glucose immediately starts to rise. Pancreas kicks in, starts secreting insulin, and then tells the cells of your body to pull glucose out of the blood. And so the levels in the blood drop. What we see is actually sometimes we secrete a little too much insulin, relatively speaking, and blood glucose in order to counter that really high level of glucose. We see the level drop, and this is where you might get cranky or hungry afterwards. And so a low glycemic diet or eating pattern is really looking and trying to encourage you to eat the foods that look more like this yellow curve, which is after you eat the food, think of something like kidney beans or garbanzo beans. You eat it, it enters your stomach, takes a while to empty into the small intestine, and once it gets there, it has to be digested by enzymes before it is digested all the way down to glucose, and those carbs can enter the bloodstream as glucose. So it takes a lot longer to digest, hit the bloodstream, and then the effect on blood glucose is a lot more gentle. So the glycemic index is, low glycemic diet is emphasizing that eating pattern. The evidence, we're seeing increasing what I would call basic science evidence, metabolic evidence, again, pointing us at biomarkers and kind of pieces of the puzzle that say this is kind of falling into place. More recently, we have several randomized controlled trials that also support this, showing lower headache days per month for someone who follows this eating pattern. Studies were generally 3 months, and till they saw a difference. And one of them followed people out even longer and saw a greater difference over time. So it's one of those you might need to be a little patient. Who might benefit? Actually similar to the ketogenic diet over ways if you have metabolic syndrome or even diabetes, just to promote general health. And what does it look like? Eating non-starchy veggies, whole grains, proteins, healthy fats, low sugar. One of the studies used personalized nutrition as well, and they had people wear a continuous glucose monitor and fed them different foods, and were able to personalize recommendations based on their personal response to specific foods. So that's exciting, ushering in a new era for us. On a similar note, this transitions us into what should we know about skipping meals, and it's related. Meal skipping has been recognized anecdotally for a long time as both a headache trigger and more specifically a migraine trigger. And objective evidence is building more and more to recognize this. And we see this in different studies that show skipping breakfast was associated with more migraines in a group of college students. Snacking at night was found to reduce the odds of a migraine attack the next day. Migraine attacks increase during the Ramadan fast from morning till sun up to sundown. And we also see, again, this basic science piece where hunger hormones shift in ways during fasting that we would expect to correlate with an increased risk of migraine. Other things to know is that we don't know the full story yet. A more recent study observing Ramadan fasts divided the month up into 3 10-day periods. And they looked that migraines increased a little bit for people on average during the first 10 days of the fast, and then started to subside after that. And so that indicates there may be some sort of adaptation that's possible with fasting over time. We also know that one of the main reasons people skip meals is stress, time availability. And so stress, of course, is a major trigger for migraines. So there may be a really complex relationship there that really prevents us from being able to study this quite readily. And another way of reducing stress or practicing mindfulness was associated with reduced meal skipping, given the evidence for mindfulness in support of using mindfulness to help with migraine. I thought that was interesting as well. But we still don't have a good study pointing to, if I say, I can't give you a number and say eat every X hours, we don't have evidence for that. So this is starting to come together. We're starting to put it all together for blood glucose, meal skipping, glycemic index, metabolism. I think it's all kind of wrapped up and researchers are excited about it. So stay tuned. And that brings us to a big question of food triggers. And not everyone likes my thoughts on food triggers. I'll warn you that. I think professional opinions are divided on these. And so I will say that I don't see the evidence bearing out for most triggers, for avoiding most food triggers, or for diets designed to remove them. There are a few that I think have the best evidence, and those are caffeine and alcohol. And again, we can point to the specific mechanisms and say what we think is happening there in terms of triggering attacks. Couple this. I'll say that a lot of the evidence for food triggers, identifying them was very poor quality. And so in trying to redo research or improve research on food triggers, it's a difficult thing to study. But one of the points of evidence that's come out in recent years suggests that food cravings that occur during the prodromal phase of an attack, so the phase before the pain hits, these studies, imaging in which parts of the brain are active, suggest that food cravings during that phase before the pain hits may be a symptom of the attack and not a cause of the attack. So it's possible, if chocolate may be a trigger for some people, it is possible, and really pay attention. Is it possible that your attack already started and you are craving chocolate and happen to consume it that way? It may not be, but something to really pay attention to. And I do want to be careful here. I do not want to minimize anyone's experience. I do believe there are more triggers out there, but I don't expect that food triggers are as common as we once thought they were. And because of that, I've sort of shifted my thinking, and the diets to remove triggers without better evidence, I think, put an unnecessary burden on a lot of people. And so I think it's important for us to develop more research on this, but developing these research designed to study what can be and seem to be very personalized triggers is very difficult. So maybe more for personalized nutrition to attack in future years. So moving on to supplements, I will say there's pretty strong consensus in the migraine community about these supplements. This came from the Migraine Canada website. Go guys. And so for these, I will say magnesium, vitamin B2, CoQ10 all have pretty good evidence. Again, consult with your healthcare provider, but the doses are listed here. These are safe supplements to take. Magnesium, the one thing, if you've tried to take 600 milligrams a day right out the bat, there are some side effects. It is not well absorbed, not terribly bioavailable. And so what's left in the gastrointestinal tract and not absorbed can pool water into the intestine and cause diarrhea and cramps. So often it's recommended with magnesium. This is great. These are the forms that are most bioavailable. So you'll have the least symptoms with magnesium citrate or glycinate most likely. But still, you probably want to start at a lower dose, maybe half of this, maybe even 200 milligrams to start, and work your way up until you get to a point where the symptoms happen. It's not dangerous to have these symptoms unless you do it for a long period of time. But generally, it's sort of a self-limiting thing. You kind of learn when you hit your limit. Vitamin B2, you won't have that problem, but you will see your urine will become much darker yellow. So if you use your urine to monitor your hydration status and you watch the color of your urine, you won't be able to do that as readily while taking vitamin B2 supplements. And coenzyme Q10, probably one of the things to consider here is it tends to be more expensive than the other supplements. So keep that in mind. I've crossed out butterbur. It had good evidence for reducing migraine over time, but it also came with some concerns about liver toxicity. And so the recommendations, and I agree, are that it's not used anymore until and if we can get better evidence of it being, this is a botanical plant, until we can get better evidence of it being purified, where we can be confident. And then the last supplement he listed here is feverfew. Again, another botanical with some evidence, but when you get into botanicals, you get into potential for more medication interaction. So definitely check with your healthcare professional there. So for this, how long do we need to follow a diet to see whether it helps with migraine? So it depends. I tried to cover this along the way, but generally the research on diet looks at a time frame of about following a diet or eating pattern for about 3 months. Same thing with supplements, typically 3 months, and then measuring to see if there's an effect. So that's sort of the safe answer, is 3 months, what the study says. But what I would encourage you to do is be really, really mindful. Pay attention to how you feel along the way. For something like if you try the low glycemic diet, really pay attention to your hunger signals. If you're eating a lot of low glycemic foods, are you as hungry? Do you get food cravings as often? You can start to pay attention along the way. And this is where, if you do practice mindfulness, if that's part of your lifestyle, then that's a good thing to build into and pay attention as you're following these diet interventions. All right. So that brings us to my overall recommendations. And I'll try to keep this quick. So for everyone, overall, my recommendation is an overall healthy diet that follows general dietary guidelines. I know this is not sexy. This is not the most amazing thing you came to hear tonight, but I think the evidence is starting to bear out in different ways that kind of these overall healthy eating patterns seem to be helping. So lots of non-starchy vegetables, a range of fruits and veggies, limit ultra-processed foods that are high in sugars and solid fats, choosing whole grains when possible, prioritizing unsweetened beverages, and going back to this plate kind of as an example of in your mind of what you want to be eating. If we do that, it's already built in. It may not be, truly low glycemic according to some definitions, but in general, it's lower glycemic than a typical diet would be. So you're getting that kind of built-in benefit. The other thing is this general healthy eating pattern is beneficial for conditions that are comorbid with migraine, that co-occur with migraine. So things like heart disease and diabetes and obesity that we tend to be at higher risk for. This diet would help with those too. So kind of a built-in benefit. If you also want to work in a little bit about fasting, again, I don't have specific numbers to give you, but I do think the evidence bears out to try to avoid skipping meals or avoid doing an extended fast. Maybe consider small, frequent meals or snacks, and eat carbs paired with protein or fat. I haven't mentioned that yet, but that helps to slow down blood glucose absorption as well. And then for the omega-3, omega-6 could also be incorporated into this with some moderate changes. You don't necessarily have to go all in, but eat fish twice a week according to the recommendations. Again, make olive oil kind of your default cooking oil, and then limit processed foods or limit the use of those vegetable oils in your own pantry. Again, you can take this piece by piece. This is, you don't necessarily have to jump in and do all at once. Again, this is not something that's been studied necessarily with relation to migraine, but there is evidence to say that if you take these lifestyle changes and dietary modifications more slowly and build them into your routine, they're more likely to stick than if you change everything at once. So if that's how, if that's what works for you, consider that. You can consider setting SMART goals, and a dietitian could help you do this as well. And you can Google SMART goals and learn about setting them. But generally, it's a small goal, time-bound, very specific, measurable, relevant to your goal that you can change and work on. And so my example is, with the olive oil, during the next 2 weeks, every time I cook, I will convert the recipe I'm making, if it uses vegetable oil, to olive oil if possible. And that's my focus for the next 2 weeks. And it just gives you something kind of latch on to. And then you can, reevaluate at the end of 2 weeks. Do I have this? Is this part of my routine? Do I feel comfortable? Yes, maybe it's time to add another goal. No, I'm going to keep working on this for a little while. For those who want to, again, there are more things you could do, but either the evidence is a little less solid, or these are harder things to work in. And so if you want to try the ketogenic diet, I do think there's evidence that it very well may work for migraine. And there's enough hope that it might work for you, but you've got to want to do it. It's not an easy diet to do. Similarly, if you really want to go all in on that high omega-3, low omega-6 diet, the recommendations were 1.5 from the second study. The recommendations were 1.5 grams of omega-3 per day, and all the way down to 2% of calories from omega-6, which is about a quarter of what we usually eat. So again, a strict thing. And then you could also discuss triggers with your healthcare provider, and definitely you could discuss supplements, especially magnesium and riboflavin with them as well. So in conclusion, I think there are a lot of reasons to be optimistic in this space, that we're getting closer and closer to more complete answers for nutrition and food and migraine. And while there is still a lot of research to do, there are nutrition and food options for you to try that balance available evidence, I think, with the challenge of making these dietary changes, and I think might be worth giving a try. And I'll just put one last plug in, that dietitians can help implement these diets, and especially to help for the stricter ones, to help mitigate any problems that might arise if you try to follow them. So with that, I will say thank you. And there's